Everyone. This is our last video for endocrine system, so we'll be finishing up today. As we mentioned, we have a little bit of pathophys to discuss, and then we also have a little bit of discussion associated to comparing and contrasting endocrine and nervous system. That's actually where I want us to start, talking about the differences between endocrine and nervous system and some of the similarities. But if you recall, the last thing we mentioned in our last video, we were discussing the differences between humoral, neural, and hormonal release for hormones. I would make sure we're comfortable with that concept. It's generally speaking pretty straightforward. All right, so we are going to get into pathophys or some of the pathology associated to this, but I am going to jump straight to here first. So this is a Venn diagram that you can find in Google Images if you want to pull it up on your side. Simply put, I just searched endocrine versus nervous Venn diagram. But this is something that I would normally draw in class to show us some of the similarities and differences. This is usually a subject matter that they love to focus on, especially for testing or when we had our final exam. So let's take a look here. If you remember in our last video, I mentioned how these two systems have some similarities, but also have differences. So let's take a look at the similarities first. Nervous and endocrine system, they both react to stimuli. That makes sense, right? We just mentioned how the hormones have to respond based off of a humoral or neural or a hormonal response overall. So they both react to something. Both help maintain homeostasis. That also makes sense. We mentioned how endocrine system, a big chunk of its purpose is to keep your body in regulation, to keep yourself functioning well. Nervous system is the same thing. Your nerves are going to send impulses just to make sure everything's fine. Both are systems of the body that send messages. Again, that seems rather self-explanatory, but they both are sending messages. They are different types of messages, as you're going to see in both sides, but they're both messages. And then the last common theme that we can find is that they both utilize the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has nervous system functions that we learned back in Nervous Part 2, and it also has endocrine functions, as we're learning in this chapter. Now, the differences, on the other hand, you'll notice it's a bit of like a compare and contrast situation. So for instance, with the nervous system, the response time is immediate, fast reactions. That is always going to be the case. Remember, we talked about how nervous impulses travel at a speed of milliseconds, a thousandth of a second. So with a speed that fast, it only makes sense that it's going to be instant to our body's ability. Whereas with endocrine system, it is a slower time. Now, sense of time is obviously relative to what we understand. But the best example I can give of this, fight or flight. Fight or flight is something directly associated to epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline. So the idea here is something startles you, something scares you, you're not sure if your body's going to be able to handle what it needs to do, so you instigate fight or flight. Epinephrine levels skyrocket in your body. If you've ever watched a horror movie, I'm not the biggest horror fan myself, but if you ever watch a horror movie and a jump scare happens and startles you, that rush sensation, that tingling sensation that you feel through your body, that's fight or flight. Now, the reason why you don't just convert into survival mode automatically is because your conscious mind is able to realize, oh, that was a moment in a movie, I'm actually safe right now, so you can calm back down a little bit. And that's the norepinephrine, or the noradrenaline as we call it, returning your body back to normal. But you do physically feel it. You do physically feel the hormones flooding through your blood, in certain cases more than others. Uses impulses to send messages. So remember, in the nervous system, it's all electrical. That's how we can send things so fast, whereas hormones are going to be the main messengers for endocrine. The organs are brain, spinal cord, and nerves, where the organs in the endocrine system are referred to as glands. We use neurons to send messages in the nervous system, the special cells, whereas in the endocrine system, you do not require neurons. You just use the bloodstream. And then finally, with regards to nervous system, remember how we have central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, all these branches. In endocrine, it's all about hormones. It's all about your adrenaline, your thyroxine, your human growth hormone, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is a great Venn diagram. If you want to have it in your notes, not a bad idea, but it really goes over a lot of the differences and similarities between these two chapters. All right, let's go back to where we were. All right, so talking a little bit about the pathology, so some of the conditions that affect these glands. This is probably the last big chunk of material. First and foremost, the pituitary gland. There are a number of conditions that can affect the pituitary gland and how the pituitary gland secretes the hormones that are so important. So, for instance, let's take a look at some of them that are affecting growth hormone, or GH. We have gigantism. Oh, we still have our click point thing. Okay. We have gigantism versus acromegaly. They are similar conditions, but different depending on when this happens. So, for example, gigantism is when you have too much growth hormone in childhood. By too much growth hormone, we're talking about people that are in the 7'5" plus range. It is an odd scenario. A lot of your like basketball players, for example, have these incredibly long wingspans, are very tall, obviously very athletic people. That said, their bodies go through a lot. Their bodies take a beating. There's only so much that a person of that stature can endure, which is why normally you don't see them playing post 35, 36, 37, depending on the case by case scenario. But a lot of these players that we idolize, it could be something difficult to understand that it's possible that in their later stages of life, they could have serious health effects because of how large their body is. Being tall is not necessarily automatically a indicator of gigantism, by the way, or acromegaly for that matter. But it can be linked to this stuff. Acromegaly, by the way, is another instance we have too much growth hormone, but this is more so adulthood. So with gigantism, every single one of us grows during puberty, right? We reach these growth spurts and our body goes through a lot of change. Acromegaly, though, is you've gone through your normal spurt, and as your body is supposed to reach a plateau of height, you continue growing a little bit more and more and more. So that's not good for obvious reasons. Finally, we have dwarfism, also known as pituitary dwarfs. Dwarfism is during childhood, not enough growth hormone, especially prepubescence. So we're talking about 6, 7, 8, 9, around there. You're supposed to continue growing at a relatively okay pace. Obviously, you have these massive spurts, but during those time periods, you're not really growing much at all. And then when pubescence hits with someone who is dealing with dwarfism, they just flat out don't really grow much. Finally, another major type of condition, we have diabetes insipidus. This is a type of diabetes. It's not your typical diabetes. It's not the one that we're so familiar with. But we have diabetes insipidus, which is a situation where you have too much antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Remember vasopressin. So it has issues. It can affect directly how much your body retains fluids. Now, pancreas. Let's go ahead and just pull this up over here so we can get a really easy way to take a look at this with some graphs. All right, type 1 versus type 2. Let's see if this gives us enough information. I guess this first part is sufficient, but I could see some other ones that are usually a little bit better. Okay. This works sufficiently. Just to give a very brief understanding of type 1, type 2, as far as how it affects the body physiologically speaking. So type 1, type 2, the long story short about type 1, type 2 diabetes is that one version of this diabetes is typically more genetic. Is typically something that affects younger individuals. People can be born with this condition. Sometimes it develops into teenage years or young adulthood. What we see here, to kind of summarize this whole process, is that in an instance with type 1 diabetes, the pancreas is unable to secrete enough insulin. If you remember, insulin is necessary to lower your blood sugar. And we all need insulin because we consume food daily, right? And we enjoy our food that we eat. If you're not secreting enough insulin, your blood sugar stays high. If your blood sugar stays high, that can cause a number of serious side effects that can be detrimental to your body's ability to function. Type 2 diabetes, on the other hand, this is a condition that usually affects people in middle of their lives to elderly years. And this is usually something that you bring onto yourself, if you want to call it that. As you can tell here, it can be inherited, So if you have family members that have had type 2 diabetes, you could be more prone to type 2 diabetes in your lifetime. So you should be careful with that. But that does not mean you will get type 2 diabetes. Many people that get type 2 diabetes, unfortunately, are dealing with severe overweight or obesity, just inactive lifestyles, and overall not eating the best. What ends up happening later on in life is that the pancreas is still trying to secrete all that insulin and keep your body functioning, but inevitably, your cells become insulin resistant. So you're secreting all the insulin you need, but unfortunately, the body is just not responding to the insulin properly. The only solution for type 2 diabetics is a dramatic change in diet and exercise and an overall life change. Because otherwise, your body functions just drastically reduce and it can get really bad. With type 2 diabetics, at the end stages of their lives, it's often common where extremities like fingers and toes may have to get removed just because those organs flat out stop functioning, or those regions of the body stop functioning. Type 1 diabetics, their lifestyle is a little bit more under control because they just need to be having insulin uh, at the ready for them. Obviously, it is a concern, especially in our country where insulin can sometimes be difficult to obtain for too many people. But if you have ample supplies of it, you can adapt your life to this, no problem. All right, the thyroid. So, as far as the thyroid is concerned, the most common condition that affects the thyroid is a condition known as Graves' disease, also known as hyperthyroidism. So, with hyperthyroidism, the thyroid is overactive. In an instance where the thyroid is overactive, that means it's secreting too many hormones. So, that's your thyroxins, that's your TSH, or not your TSH, your thyroidine, all these type of hormones that we were discussing. This is typically an autoimmune disease, by the way. So the immune system starts to attack your thyroid. The opposite of thyroidism is called hypothyroidism. Hypothyroidism is when the thyroid is not working enough. So this can lead to a couple different things. We have this condition called myxedema. This is an adult case. Cretinism is typically a case that affects children. It can cause these massive goiters due to insufficient iodine. In some cases where the thyroid is overactive or underactive, this can actually lead to drastic metabolic changes. So, for some people, like for instance, who are suffering from severe obesity, it's not because they just don't eat well or don't act or exercise. Sometimes the thyroid has such a slow metabolic rate that they're not converting it to energy efficiently. So they're storing so much. Or the opposite, someone could be severely underweight, and it's not because they're bulimic or anorexic. It could just simply be that the thyroid is overactive and it's consuming too much at once. Oh, sorry about that. All right. So here we're able to see some of these examples of Graves' disease. So in the cause of hyperthyroidism, something that can happen in a more extreme case, you can actually notice the eyes will start to bulge. It is a rather severe situation. I've actually remember seeing videos growing up of uh, people with these, like they'd go on talk shows and say like, "Oh yeah, my eyes can bulge out of my sockets," and it's like a cool party trick. It could be a thyroid problem if that's happening. And then with the goiters, something you see here, in a lot of impoverished countries where they're not consuming enough iodine on a day-to-day basis, this can be a direct cause, and this can directly happen to this. It can cause the thyroid to not function as well as it can, and it causes it to swell substantially to the size of like a softball in your throat. The good news is, in a lot of modern countries, especially like ours, for instance, they've done entire things to improve our health. This is honestly the reason why governments are essential, to make sure that, hey, our bread is more enriched, our water has necessary compounds like fluorine, for example, but iodine specifically is now found in almost all forms of greens. It's now near impossible to consume a daily nutrition or your daily diet without consuming iodine, at least here in the United States. All right, a little bit more pathology. As far as the adrenal gland is concerned, we noticed some two conditions here. We have Cushing syndrome versus Addison's disease. Cushing syndrome is caused by ACTH secreting pituitary tumor. So typically speaking, this is going to be hypersecretion, so too much. So I'll actually write that over here on the side. Let's try that again, because that was obviously... All right, that's as close as we're going to get. So Cushing syndrome is hyper secretion of the adrenal glands. So too much is being secreted. Um, when this happens, this is something that can be very substantially difficult for the body to maintain itself. Because as we mentioned, the adrenal glands help to secrete your hormones that are necessary for survival, just your fight or flight type stuff. So if this is overreactive, can be super detrimental. And then the opposite of this is Addison's disease. Addison's disease is a hyposecretion, so not enough coming specifically from the adrenal cortex. This usually involves cortisol and aldosterone. So this can cause low blood glucose and sodium, severe dehydration, fatigue, loss of appetite, abdominal pain. Interestingly enough, famous author Jane Austen, she suffered from Addison's disease. This is something that directly affected her. And here we're able to see just some of the things that tend to happen with Cushing's disease in a healthy woman. And then over time, as Cushing's disease starts to get into effect, it actually does create a small like humpback scenario closer to the beginning of the neck region. Again, a lot of these conditions can be treated with relative ease as long as it's caught early enough and you start doing the right methods of treatment and the right methods of just working around it and trying to figure out how do you deal with this, how do you substantiate it. The problem is with a lot of these hormonal conditions that we just talked about, they're not really things that can be cured. It's more like things that can be worked with and lived with. And if we can't cure it yet, the best option is making it so that someone who has one of these conditions can live with it as well as they can. All right. So that was our final video for endocrine system, a bit on the longer side, but overall, I would just make sure we've gone over all of our material for endocrine system. If you have any questions, remember I'm in my Google Hangouts office hours. Just check the schedule as far as when I'm around. Just shoot a message in the chat room. We can start a video chat if you prefer. But other than that, that should be it. Let me know if you need any help with any of this stuff, guys.